And I've talked about controlling emotions and getting on top of it. I'm jumping into the privacy realm as I kind of drift out of what the government can do, because they can use any of these systems to screw with you. Propaganda is way beyond just the words now. What the military actually spent a good bit of money on was looking at the brain, the activity of energy coming off of a brain, for two reasons. They let contracts in 2013, now 7 years ago. And what they did in the University of California, who won them, one was to look at the complex signaling coming off of a brain to try and interpret the thoughts of people. And then with that information be able to create complex signaling that would then be able to transfer thoughts directly into people. Now, what were they going to do with that? They were going to engage in something that the directorate, the electromagnetic directorate of the Air Force, calls controlled effects. In fact, you can read their publication that they actually issue that talks about all the latest things, technology horizons. And what they talked about there was controlled effects that would override all of those senses that I talked about: hearing, sight, smell, taste, touch. Override them to create complete memory sets that would be impossible to distinguish a memory artificial from a memory real. Now, at first you think, wow, that'd be weird, but how about court hearings? And how about evidence in court hearings? Wow, now that gets interesting, doesn't it? Which was your memory and which wasn't? That might get a bit confusing, right? So shouldn't someone go to prison or under the prison if they violate rights like this and start dabbling in your brain and messing with your thoughts? How about education? How about compulsory education? Because here's what's coming. How about this, where the interface is so good that instead of spending years to learn information, you learn it in hours? That's coming. You'll see it. Who's going to control that curriculum, that download into your biological matrix of a brain? That's important questions. That's where our technology takes us. That's what PBS said is the worldwide mind. Who's going to do the programming? And I don't think it's 60 years out. This is happening way too fast. When we hit technology, you'll see it. You know, technology, just as a point of reference, used to double, from the invention of the wheel and discovery of fire to 1985. In that frame, it was doubling every 5 years. Technology, all of it, doubling every 5 years. And then by the 90s, the late 90s, it was like every 9 months. With what's happened since then, it's got to be like monthly. Doubling our knowledge, who can even discern what it's about? So principally driven activity becomes really important when the knowledge base is expanding so rapidly, and the correlation and looking at the integration of that is not. There is where the danger is, and a lot of what we're seeing happen today, unexpected consequences of every kind, because we've created too much complexity when simplicity is also required. The law library is a good example of complexity. It's just one. Earth Rising 1 and Earth Rising 2, what were those books about? They were the forewarning of what was happening. One was written just before 9/11 and one was written after, because after we were too late. And I say that, and I'll point to a couple of books, and they're handy and they're right here, so let me just grab them. And one of them, and this is my history section if you remember, and that's where a couple things, this is the best history book I ever read. And an expediter, one of the guys who worked with me, a guy named Ray Gray, turned me on to this book, and it was written in 1936. It's called A New American History by W.E. Woodward, Woodward. It's a used book. You can find them. Find it. It ought to be back in print. It's the best U.S. history I ever read. It's almost 900 pages. In fact, it is exactly 900 pages. And what it is the man who wrote this, he wrote it in his late 50s. He was a businessman who loved history. So all of his spare moments, his whole life, he spent in libraries whenever he traveled all over. And he collected and he interviewed the original people. Now remember, 1936. So he was interviewing people that fought in the Civil War. He was interviewing people whose grandfathers were in the War of 1812, okay? This guy was talking to firsthand sources when income tax was created. You know, income tax in The 1890s was illegal. The U.S. Supreme Court said that was slavery and we couldn't have that. A lot of people don't know that. We'll talk about that later. But this history is a history of the country from a very different perspective up to the point in the very last entries they start talking about the Nazis showing up in Europe. So this is pre-World War II, very important time in history before everything really industrialized, worth reading. From a man who was passionate about history, and the footnotes, the work he did to prove his point is just beautiful. He just did a really fine job, so I recommend it. Now the other one that's really relevant in what we're talking about today is John Peterson. He's the founder of the Arlington Institute, and John I met, and I don't know him as a friend, I just know him from a couple events. He attended one of my lectures in Colorado a number of years ago, and I got hold of his book because he and I got in a little bit of a debate because he was a consultant to the Pentagon, to their think tanks, as a futurist. And I wasn't really happy about the Pentagon and what was happening there in a lot of ways. And I must say this, having done this now for this many years, I'll say there's a lot of very, very good people through every institution of government, particularly our military. And there are a bunch of principled men and women throughout the institution who did swear an allegiance to a constitution that they do believe in. And I hope they remember it. You know, Snowden reported on a bunch of things and blew the whistle on a bunch of things. I have his book up here too, because it's worth reading, you know, and he had something to say. And Snowden did have a lot to say. And he said it in his own words, all right? And I recommend you go read Permanent Record, that you take a look at what the man said. And then you read this one, Poisoner in Chief, because this is a story of Sidney Gottlieb, the guy who was behind mind control for the CIA. And he was an evil SOB, I can tell you. And Snowden wasn't. Snowden was telling the truth. He was saying that all of our allies' phones were being tapped by our government. He said that we were doing things that were illegal, that were criminal, and he was correct. And the fact of the matter is, our government's been doing a lot of things against every one of us, and doing it in our names. Not for you and me, but for corporate America, the ones who write the laws in this country. And that's not coming from some arbitrary view. I have 3 generations in this. At the international, national, state, and local issues. All the way through these structures, I've had family members. And it is corrupted. We've seen it. We've watched it. We see it today. It has to be unknotted, and it won't be until you as citizens and me as a citizen engage this a bit differently, but not as if we're going to go attack something and fight it. That's been the problem. We need to resolve the internal work. Now, what did he do as a futurist? Okay, this guy did these neat little deals where he took, like, okay, here's one. Social breakdown in the United States. Okay, early indicators. Growth in the militia movement and public's growing dissatisfaction with political leaders. How about this? Continued growth in federal deficit, possibly of downstream financial failure. Ineffectiveness of public schools. Increased disparity between the haves and have-nots. Well, sounds like today, right? Well, when did this book get written? 20 years ago, 1999, right? There's 100 of these. They're all accurate. They're all accurate. These were done for the Pentagon, and they're not 2 pages at the Pentagon. These were done with think tanks. And the kinds of scenarios in here, pandemic, look it up, see what happened. Hey, did they plan it? Yes, they planned what they would do if it ever happened. Did they cause it? I'm not going there with anybody, because that's an argument you'll never make. Did they know what to do if it happened? Yes. But was it the right thing to do? Well, you decide. Here's who has a playbook on the shelf. Every government that's any good, every private company that's any good, and every family that has any brains for more than 1 generation and has kept track of things. Because keeping track of things also creates a playbook. You see A, you do B. Here in Alaska, we have a playbook. Our economy cycles. If you've been here long enough, you know that. You're ready for the down cycle because you know it's coming. All right? So Time gives you perspective. They teach you things about circumstance that bring likelihoods of probabilities that allow you to plan things. The Pentagon would like to point to conspiratorialists as the paranoid thinkers. It's not how it works. They're the paranoid thinkers because that is their job. The military's job is to think of every horrible thing that you could ever imagine and build a plan to take care of it. Whether it's aliens landing on the White House lawn, and now the Navy's talking about aliens flying around, or whether it's, what I just read, or a pandemic, or any number of things. They create the playbook so they know exactly what they're going to do, and then they execute it. So the thing happens, playbook comes off the shelf, book gets opened, plan gets played. You don't think the World Health Organization had one? You don't think China had one? China studies, and we'll get into China, we're going to talk about China and the way of thinking that leads to the art of war and how it's applied in everything. But surveillance, as we talk about this now, China's the master of that game. Here's how they do their surveillance. Cameras everywhere. It used to be London was the most surveyed place in the world, but now it's China. Cameras everywhere. They got everyone ID'd. They know who you are when you come in. They know who you are when you go out. They know everything you did while you were there. Every transaction that you ever had, everything you ever did that can be electronically tracked is, and they give you a social score. Now, a lot of people know that now. A lot of people don't. What does a social score in China let you do? Well, decides whether you have a job, whether you can fly out of the country, whether you get a passport, whether your kids go to college, like everything. And if you're really misbehaved, they'll put your picture in your neighborhood up on a bulletin board and embarrass you so that you'll get shamed by all of your buddies into behaving yourself. Social control, social scoring is happening there. Now, just across the border in India, they're not doing that yet. What they're doing there is they're doing biometrics on a mass scale. It's almost finished. They got, I think, 100 million left to do out of over 1.3 billion in population. Biometrics is like a fingerprint. That would be a biometric measure. So in India, a lot of people don't have fingerprints because they've worn them off. Okay, let me say that again. They don't have them because they've worn them off. But they take a set from everybody, but because so many have worn them off, they also do an iris scan, where they look at the iris, which is as unique as your fingerprint. The problem there is a lot of people in India don't have eyes because they're blind. And a lot of beggars actually will blind their kids so they can beg better. I mean, this is horrible what happens, but so they can't just do a fingerprint and an iris scan. They also do a facial scan. So they do all three, and that gets you qualified for any program the government offers. Otherwise, you're not in. Okay, this is important. Not only are you not in, but if you owned 1,000 rupee notes, which happen to be the ones used for bribery throughout the country pretty frequently, they gave a certain amount of time, 30 days, to turn them all in and explain where you got them, or they weren't worth anything anymore. That was the same time they wiped out the ability to do cryptocurrencies in their country and banks to accept them. So each thing is designed to do something. Now what happened there is a lot of people were stuck with bribery money they couldn't spend. Eventually it's all going to be electronic because then you can't have black money in the economies at all. Every transaction's noted. Everything you buy gets noted then, and we're headed that way. Digital currency, blockchain is being talked about as the panacea for privacy. No, it isn't. It's guarantees. Why is blockchain so valuable? Because it IDs something to someone perfectly, as long as you got the numbers, right? It creates a chain of title that's perfect. That's why they want to use it for certain things. A chain of title. Who had what, who did what, with what. So right now it looks invisible, looks like you can do whatever you want, but watch. As they uncover all the black money in the system, because that's really what it's about, and making sure there isn't any out of the system. So then everything about you is known. All of your transactions will tell them everything that's left to know about you is what you consume. We'll do it. Whether it's information, transportation, food, whatever, entertainment, that'll tell them more than anything. Magazines, books, you name it. It'll tell them everything. So that's the world we're in. The quantum computing side of this I want to mention just briefly because I talked about the data valence, the idea of collecting it all. Quantum computing is something that's either here or about to be here, depending on who you read. But let me talk about what that means. When a supercomputer of 20 years ago, the last time I looked up the numbers, it would take everybody on the planet, at that time about 7 billion people with hand calculators doing a calculation every 60 seconds for about 60 hours to do in 1 second what a supercomputer did in those days in 1 second. Think about it, billions and billions of people, hand calculators going for 60 hours to do what a computer does in a second. Now imagine that computer that could do all that in a second running for 1 trillion years. I mean, it goes beyond what you can even imagine, right? 1 trillion years, and a second of it was all those billions of people for 60 hours doing all those calculations. Now you're running 1 trillion years. A quantum computer will do what a supercomputer did in 1 trillion years in an hour. An hour. This changes everything about everything, whoever gets there first, because every encryption system in the world is obsolete, almost immediately. They can hack through things so rapidly this whole world will be exposed. That's the truth of the matter. That's where quantum computing will take us, if it goes there, and depending on who gets it first, right? Because the motivations of governments are all different. And you know what makes governments the most powerful today? It's not you and me anymore. It's the technology they control. You see? And that technology that they control is so powerful. It decides so much. And think about what happens to review that. We'll talk about it later, about the Congress and the capability of regulating high technology. Because this is really what it's about. Our governing system, when we have representative governments like we do, then you have to agree, right? And you have to know enough to ask good questions. And in a rising environment of secrecy, with cameras pointed on all of us, and big data and big information being manipulated constantly, what was the Pentagon doing like 20 years ago? One of the programs they got caught, it was called Total Awareness. They were going to use all these systems to gain a total profile of us. And they got caught, so they didn't do it. Instead, the Central Intelligence Agency and other security agencies, they actually have venture funds. You know, they fund independent contractors. Because if you don't know this, you'll know this now. The Freedom of Information Act, where you can get information about what government's doing, exempts private contractors. So they use a lot of private contractors, the way you skirt the law, avoid the scrutiny. So Total Awareness, they couldn't do as a government program, but Google and Facebook filled up the void and provided everything they could possibly want to profile everyone all the time. Now your cell phone traffic, that's very helpful too. And your postal mail. Do you know that every piece of mail is photographed, return address in two, and then collated and indexed? Every single one that has a return address. So maybe you might not want to do that on some mail, but just know that that's being kept track of. That's important. Every time you talk on the phone, there's 5 governments cooperating on this, electronic. And this was done after World War II, and it's an agreement that still exists today, and it's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Great Britain, and the United States. And we do signal intelligence for each other. The NSA was created for this purpose. So we track everybody else's communications theoretically and violate all their privacy, and they violate all our privacy, and then they exchange the data using what are called dictionaries, which are key words. That anytime a key word is used in a conversation or a written piece of electronic data, it's extracted, and then once it's extracted, then it draws attention to that person where they're scrutinized and looked at. People like Snowden are the ones who look at these guys. NSA has thousands and thousands of people. In fact, the government didn't even know it. Congress was driving by Maryland, one of the NSA's buildings, and Congress said, "What the heck is that building there?" Well, you funded it. It's 9,000 people working there, and they're surveying all of the communication internationally. And he didn't even know he was doing it. We had listening stations in Germany. The Germans didn't even know we were there until Snowden blew the whistle, and then they threw us out. Because we were invading everybody's privacy as if we should, and that was some kind of an American principle, to trample over everyone's rights. So, and here's the argument that the U.S. Army War College was making at the time. Oh, don't worry, the Constitution ends at the border. It doesn't apply in the rest of the world. But don't tell that to American servicemen when they're fighting overseas, because they're fighting for that. or they're fighting for nothing. We're going to take a break here in a few minutes. I want to get into the privacy a little deeper. Before we move on, I'd hoped this would go a little bit quicker. It was too important to just blow over. This is the beginning of what has trapped us that we got to peel away a little bit. So we're going to dive back into privacy again, but we need to take a little break. My technicians are getting tired. You know, these guys have been working hard and getting ready last night, and I'm just hitting my stride. So we got a ways to go. We're going to have a lot of fun, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. So hang in there with us. All right, you know, a little bit of a break. I guess we hit the end of the 10-hour reel, and we're going into the second 10 hours really to begin this part. I'm going to switch places in a minute, but I want to wrap up the privacy and surveillance issues. I want to hit a couple more points, and one I didn't make before. All the cameras are pointed at us right now in every which way, and I talked about the social scoring in China. I talked about the biometrics in India. And now think about this. You know, I've had times when people have asked me for thumbprints to cash checks. I don't like that. I complained about that to the bank that was leaving Alaska, and that was Bank America, because I won't bank with them anymore because of it. And the bank that replaced them was North Rim Bank. And I called them before they took over, and I talked to their managers, and I said, look, if you're going to require this, I'm not only not going to bank with you, I'm going to make a point of it anytime I'm on radio to talk about it. And they did the opposite. They didn't require that, and they still don't. And that's why I bank with them, because they don't need a thumbprint they're never going to use to catch a thief that's never going to be that dumb. You know, and the systems, the way they're set up, why do they need this? It's a false sense of security to gather more data about you and make you feel like, okay, it's okay to give it up. It started at the airports. You know, there was a time when I grew up where you didn't have to show ID to buy a plane ticket. You go in there and say your name is John Smith, they'd sell you a ticket, you get on a plane, fly somewhere. That's how it worked. You actually dressed up to go take a flight. You know, people didn't show up in their pajamas and go through security. They didn't do any of that. It was a way different deal. And we used to go to the airport. We could even hang out at the restaurant and say goodbye to our friends out the window at the gate. Imagine that. You know, as a kid, I used to be able to walk up the steps of the Capitol in the United States Capitol, you know, that one there in Washington, D.C. And I didn't have to go through security to go in the rotunda, you know, where you can look at all of that and you can whisper on one side and hear it really loud on the other because the acoustics are so perfect. You didn't have to go through security. You didn't have to do that until you got to the gallery of the U.S. House or Senate where they had security, because some idiot during the Cuban days of hassles going on in Cuba, you know, wanted to machine gun a bunch of senators. But it was relatively open. You know, you could walk into buildings and you could be in your capital, and we can't anymore. In fact, right now, as I'm making this film, you can't go there. Lobbyists can't even go there, which is kind of a good thing, but, you know, not for the rest of us. You can't get on Capitol Hill in a congressional office today in America. My son just came back from 3 weeks in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol, but to be there, he had to be an intern at 43 years old. He's an intern. He has a baby face. He could pass for 20. But he's there looking at that situation, learning about government from the inside for things he's thinking about in the future. You know, should he run? Should he be the next Nick Begich in Congress? Maybe he will be. He's making that decision. I've tried to talk him out of it. Believe it or not, because I already gave up my dad for public service. Now I got to give up my firstborn son for public service. And I'm going to lose the relationship I have with him, which is every day I get a chance to talk to him, not this week because we've all been busy, but generally that's the way it goes. And we work with each other. Some of the folks here know the relationship I have with my son. And I've talked to him about it because it'll go away then, because he'll be serving you, and I won't have that anymore. I'm going to give him up so you guys can have his service if that's what he decides to do. And when he makes the decision, whichever way it is, I'm going to be there with him. If he says, no, I'm not doing it, Dad, I'm going to continue to run the 60 companies I've helped build. Or he's going to say, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give up all that. Whatever he decides, I'm there with him. But I know he gives up a lot if he does that. And I lose a lot if he does personally, but boy, do I know you got the right guy, because on these issues, privacy and surveillance, his undergraduate work is in entrepreneurship, and his graduate work is in neural networking. And he has a company, a software company, 150 employees in it. That's his company that he built with one, starting with one him. And so he knows what a lot of people in Congress don't know. We need somebody like that. And we don't have educated people in the Congress that can go into closed hearings where their staff isn't allowed, they cannot make notes, and they cannot discuss what they hear there with anyone. And then they get the dog and pony show from whoever's presenting, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, whoever it is, and there's no one there with enough science knowledge to ask the kind of questions that I asked Reho Michaela when I was 19, that I mentioned in a lecture hours and hours ago. Because he doesn't have the brains in the Congress. People don't have the brains in the Congress, not because they're not smart people. They lack that body of knowledge to challenge the body of knowledge being presented. So when technology decides everything about whether a constitution is real, you have to have people who know enough to ask the right questions and insist on honest answers. And we don't have that. And we don't have whistleblower mechanisms that protect the Snowdens of the world so that governments aren't violating us in every single way in our names.